after university, I would often go to this little river, set up a slackline over the river, and then after walking a couple of times, feeling safe, I would just walk in with my clothes on. You know, walking over water with your clothes on. And then when you fall, it's kind of stupid and annoying, but it's not nearly as bad as dying. And then getting more confident from there, I would walk with my backpack on, with all my books and everything from university, because I really was sure I wouldn't fall, but still, it doesn't compare to the ultimate consequence. And then at some point, I found myself holding my phone in one hand, and maybe like a drink in the other hand, like anything to increase the consequence and thus the pressure to perform, to get used to that. And in fact, the higher the consequence was, I found that my focus increased with it. I didn't just learn to focus as much, but I was automatically starting to focus more when the stakes were higher. And that increased focus, that's really the whole point of free soloing. That's really the point, to get in the present moment, to forget about the past and the future, to become completely aware of yourself in the moment and of your dynamic environment and of the very subtle interactions between you and your environment as you have it, for example, on the slackline.
There are many spiritual practices, and they're now being investigated scientifically as never before. And what they're about, as I show in my most recent book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, is about going beyond our normal states of consciousness and feeling we're connected with something greater than ourselves. And what's so striking is there are so many ways of doing this. Probably meditation is the most common. And the whole point of meditation is to shut down the default mode network, the chattering mind, the internal dialogue, the worries, the anxieties, the fears, and come into the present. But when I was working on this, a friend of mine who's a mountain climber in Canada talked to me about sports and his own experience rock climbing. He said when he was most busy in his work, he couldn't meditate. His mind was chattering away. But by the time he was 50 feet up a rock face, he was totally in the present. And I realized that actually, in terms of coming into the present, sports are probably the main way in the modern world in which people do this. And I think that they're probably a very unacknowledged aspect of spiritual practice. They're normally seen as totally secular. And the sports that do it most are extreme sports, which is why I got interested in extreme sports. Free climbing, free diving, and a whole range of other extreme base jumping, a whole range of extreme sports. And it seemed to me that the point about them seemed to be about being on the very edge of death. I mean, you have to focus, you have to be totally present. If your concentration lapses for a second, you could be dead. And I imagine, never having done it myself, that this is part of it. And so it's fascinating to hear about your experience and the fact that for you, part of it is that feeling of being totally present.
Yeah.
And when that happens to you, how do you, I mean, you're obviously being totally present and concentrating on what you're doing, but do you feel that you're entering a completely different state of consciousness?
I think I am, and the reason why I would call it a different state of consciousness is because you know how you can usually backtrack what you've been thinking about for the last 5 minutes.
Yes.
When after a free solo walk, I know I've walked, but I can't really remember what happened in my mind. You know, it's like I'm so in this moment that I don't even I don't even notice time going by to some extent, and so it's definitely some kind of altered consciousness because I've never experienced it in other moments. Yeah. You can always kind of backtrack what you've been thinking about for the last 2 minutes, but after the 2 minutes of soloing, I don't know, there was nothing. There was just doing.
Yes. So you're totally in the present.
Yeah, 100%.
And when the state of being in the flow, would you say that's the same kind of thing? You're totally in the present, present with the actions you're doing?
Yes. In that moment, yes. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do it. And like ideally, you would do everything in that way, right? but usually the mind wanders.
Yes.
In most activities. But it would be amazing to be able to really achieve flow in most of the things. And I'm working towards it in yoga, but I still find it very difficult.
Yes, well, that was another thing I found particularly interesting, the way you combine this with yoga and this body awareness, that yoga helps you towards a greater awareness of all different parts of your body. Do any other free climbers or highliners, is yoga a common feature of his?
Yeah, it's becoming a very common feature. And Alex Honnold, that you just mentioned from Free Solo, he also does yoga. I think he also, just like me, he probably started it mostly for the physical benefits of stretching your muscles and so on and so on. But I know so many people highlining or climbing at a high level who do yoga, and it's kind of an exception to meet an outdoor or extreme sport athlete who doesn't at least sometimes do yoga. It's almost an exception.
It's fascinating. I'd never heard that before, and it makes total sense. I mean, it fits with the spiritual practice angle that I've been thinking about. I mean, obviously, since you're so close to death, I mean, this must bring up thoughts of death when you're not doing it. Do you ever think about what happens when you die?
A little bit, yeah.
Yes.
Like the closest I've come to really thinking about dying, like the deepest experience with that was on a psychedelic trip, and that was on the same day that I had walked the Free Solo. Later in that night, I got involved with a certain psychedelic substance, and was really, really reflecting on the topic of death, was kind of having an interaction with death. It was crazy. I'd be willing to tell you more in detail about that psychedelic experience later.
Why not?
I don't want to go too much into detail right now, because most psychedelics are still illegal, unfortunately. But
well, I'm told by Michael Pollan, who wrote a book about them, that he feels free talking about them as long as he doesn't say where or when.
Okay, so I already said it was. Yeah. Okay.
Just those of you who haven't come much across Rupert in the early, would I say, the 90s or 80s, when you used to have your get-togethers with Terence McKenna in California and Rolf Abrahams to really explore the psilocybin consciousness and the effects of all of these psychoactive plants. And Rupert's got an incredibly rich history on that aspect of understanding.
Well, not as rich as Terence McKenna, but no one could rival Terence in this respect. But no, he was a great friend of mine, and we were. I'm interested in this partly for personal reasons, obviously, but partly because I think it does reveal something about the nature of the mind. And I mean, without necessarily going into the details of the psychedelic experience, what do you think it revealed to you about the nature of death?
Death revealed itself during that trip kind of as an experience, another experience, because I am all about experience, about learning. I love experiencing new things, new places, new peoples, doing new things. And I realized in that moment that death would eventually be another, in its very own way, incredible experience. Obviously one that you only do once, but also more.
Well, it depends if you believe in reincarnation.
Well,
you can do
okay,
it
so only once in that very world or life.
Only
that you're
once in this life, yes.
Only once in this life, and therefore probably the most unique and intense experience ever. And me being so into experiences and adventures, I was, in a weird, strange way, I was starting to kind of look forward, but in a way of, in the same way as you look forward to something that you want to save for very late. You know,
Yes, obviously, given your
not
life.
tomorrow, not in a year. I realized, okay, like this is going to happen a long, long ways down in the future, and then it's going to be awesome when the time has come.
Yes.
That's kind of how I started thinking about it.
With regards to that, you're philosophizing on death, and I was speaking to one of the guys earlier on today about Friedi, and the adrenaline that you seek, that moment of presence on a highline whilst you free solo without the leash, and what is constantly going to feed you to get that higher fix, because when you first started slacklining, it was something new, it was something different. So your journey, is it towards death? Is your journey that you're looking for that fix until it becomes an unsustainable fix, because the marginal return of that feeling becomes less and less, so you start exploring greater levels of, well, perhaps your skill set is rising, but you're exploring greater, you're going to do the first 2 kilometer highline free solo, or the first highline free solo across the Cape Point when the 2 oceans collide, and there's this line that's moving one side to the other side, and you're doing that. So is there this constant, perhaps unsustainable journey, and therefore that's why you're not scared of death in a way, because it's another experience?
There's definitely, so a lot of times people do that analogy between adrenaline and drugs, as in like substances. And there is, fair enough, you can develop a tolerance. You can develop a tolerance towards adrenaline. You might do something that's extremely exciting, do it a couple of times, not as exciting anymore. However, with free solo highlining, I do it very rarely. And I keep myself, like I said earlier, I try to check my ego, I stay reflecting, always look back at what happened and think about what's gonna happen. I try to stay very conscious and constantly thinking and critically questioning my actions. And so when I find myself soloing and really feeling super comfortable, maybe thinking about doing these tricks, la-di-da, free solo, then something in my conscious brain tells me, stop, take a month off, or 2, or something like that. And that's kind of how I try to not go deeper and deeper and deeper, because it's not about getting closer and closer to death. I think for me it's more about getting to know yourself, and I got to know myself the best in those close, high stakes situations.
What other situations in your life do you find put you into this kind of state? Is this the unique feature of this, that you get into this total presence and flow?
It's the strongest one.
Yes.
It's the strongest one. In yoga, I really think yoga takes years of practice, but I'm slowly getting towards that feeling where I'm really in the moment, but then it usually only lasts for a minute or less.
Yes.
In soloing, it usually lasts as long as I walk, basically.
Well, yeah, it has to, I suppose.
Yeah. And so far those are basically the only places that I found it. I mean, maybe when I was younger, I used to be into drawing and painting and arts, also music. Arts and music, I think, are also places that can be very spiritual and very where you can experience that flow state.
Yes.
Almost as much, or maybe even more, as in sports.
Or dancing as well.
Dancing, yeah.
The thing is that so you're interested in music too, then?
Yeah, I don't really play instruments, but I enjoy music. I love consuming music.
Yes.
Yeah. I do play didgeridoo, yeah, but not much.
Well, I think the thing is, you see, there are some spiritual practices like meditation which are about being completely still and calm. And there are others like sports, especially extreme sports, and music and dancing, which are about movement. I personally interpret them as, I think that the ultimate spiritual reality in most traditions is seen as Trinitarian, threefold. The Hindu one is Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Sat is the ground of being, Chit is the contents of consciousness, names and forms. And Ananda is about bliss, joy, and flow. And the Christian model is the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. The Father is the ground of being. The Logos, the second person of the Trinity, is names and forms. What you know, it's the knower, the known. And then the Holy Spirit is the principle of movement, change, flow, and freedom. And I personally think that some spiritual practices, the ones about movement and flow, which is like highlining and like music and dancing, are really tuning into the aspect of the spirit, because it's all about being in the flow.
Definitely.
Whereas other spiritual practices like meditation are more like going to the very ground of consciousness itself, the Sat aspect of consciousness, the ground of being, the ground of consciousness. And then other forms like appreciating the beauty of flowers or buildings or visual arts are about names and forms. They're about the logos aspect of the ultimate reality. So I think ultimate consciousness is itself differentiated into the knower, the known, and the flow. And so I think this particular kind of spiritual practice is tuning into the flow aspect.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my own interpretation, because I was trying to think when I was writing this book and the previous book on science and spiritual practices, how such completely different practices can all be spiritual and relate to the realm of the spirit, when seemingly they're totally different. And the answer is the realm of the spirit has this internal differentiation with different aspects. So, I mean, when would you say that most people who do this they must have thought about dying? I mean, do you think most of them are not afraid of dying, or do you think some of them actually want to die? I mean, an obvious point that must get raised, it must be a frequently asked question, is this basically comes some kind of suppressed suicidal bid or desire for extinction or oblivion, which takes this rather sophisticated form?
So, so I'm basically friends with all of the very few people who free solo highline. I know a couple of free solo climbers, and I have quite a few friends who base jump, all of which could be considered extreme sports and bringing yourself close to death sometimes. Everybody has thought about dying and talk about it. Some people joke about it. The answer that everybody gives is everybody says, no, I don't want to die. They really are convinced that they won't die. Some, especially among the base jumpers, some say I most likely won't die, but if I die, it'll be doing what I love most, and it'll be not a bad way of dying. And as much as I love life and don't want to die, I also don't think that we need to live a perfectly 100% safe life with no danger around us whatsoever. I think danger has always been around, and I think seeking 100% safety every day is not natural.
Well, I agree. I mean, one of the things that I think about is that we live in a culture obsessed with risk assessment, health and safety legislation, and so forth. And it's precisely this culture obsessed with health and safety and minimization of risk that's produced extreme sports.
Exactly.
I mean, I lived in India for 7 years, and a lot of Indians live pretty close to death, not through extreme sports.
They would look at this
one.
Like,
they'd be, the danger of starvation in some places, killed by wild animals, murdered by bandits. There's all sorts of ways you can die. You can die in childbirth if you're a woman, because there's not very good care and health facilities. So they live quite close to death, and a lot of people die, including a lot of children. So we are insulated from death to an unprecedented degree in the whole of human history. And it's particularly interesting that what the societies that have produced extreme sports are ones where ordinary life has had normal risks minimized to such an extraordinary degree that there's kind of reaction against it. I mean, most Indians and people who live in situations where they are close to death are not very drawn to extreme sports.
No, they don't free solo highline or base jump there.
No, and I imagine that most people taking part in highline are white males from relatively
and white females,
backgrounds.
luckily.
And females too.
If you were able to bring about that same focus, but not on a wire, could you reach the same tranquility or feeling of euphoria?
Yeah, like I said, I think if you meditate a lot, people who meditate for years, they can get there. And so, like you said earlier, I think it was you who said that psychedelics could be called cheating by some people. Maybe what I do is my way of cheating, because meditation is too exhausting for me. I haven't been successful with meditation. But all these things can lead to very similar kinds of joy. But so far, for me, only the sports have worked. And honestly, I think there are very few people in the world who can achieve these states in all different ways. I think everybody's an individual. Everybody has to find their way. My way is for sure the sport of balancing high up in the air. That's kind of my way, and I haven't even tried very hard to find it outside of the sport, because that's my way, and I'm going my way. I would love to ask you a question, if I may.
All right, of course.
It's really like personal curiosity that has just arisen right now. What do you think was the most dangerous moment of your life, or most scary moment of your life?
Well, it was to do with height. I was living in Malaya. I was working at the University of Malaya in the botany department. And I had a friend who was working on tropical trees. And he said, we'll climb, we've got some sort of metal things in the trunk of this huge tropical tree in the middle of the jungle. And there's a platform at the top. And so we climbed up this tree. I'm a bit frightened of heights, and I'm not very good at this sort of thing. So anyway, he was Australian and made me feel that if I didn't do it, you know, it wasn't a proper man and that kind of thing. So he motivated me by this kind of Australian method. I've also had most of my scary experience have been with Australians. And anyway, so I got up there, and he went first, and he said, there's one of these things has come out, and he said, the other one seems a bit loose, you just have to pull yourself up from there. So there I am, sort of hanging off this platform. I get up there, and then the platform's slightly rotten. He said, oh, no one's been up here for a while, it's a bit rotten, and so you don't mind that bit. So I get up to this platform, and my heart's pounding, my throat's dry, my legs are shaking. I'm completely terrified. And then the thought, I was terrified to then the thought of how am I going to get down was even more terrifying.
Yeah.
And so I think that was probably the most frightening experience of my life.
Most frightening. See, yeah. Now we don't know if it was also the most dangerous, though. Like,
well,
for
it was actually very dangerous.
Yeah, but it's really hard to put a number on danger, like mathematically. You might have been in a lot higher statistical danger on the road. You know, everybody drives in their life, and there may be close calls with people rushing past us, closer calls than we think. All that might be more dangerous than what you've experienced. But I appreciate, like, it does sound very frightening. I can imagine, for sure. Thank you for this story.
I want to really thank Freddie for
welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you. Pleasure. Big pleasure.